Jim, Rob, I want to welcome you to the fifth in our series of conversations with Jim Arieti. Welcome to you both. Good morning.
Good
Good
morning.
morning.
Let's go ahead and get started. Today, we'll generally focus on the topic of education. It's wonderful to have two educators here. So I will just kick off the conversation. Maybe start with you, Rob. Reflections of having been both a student and now a colleague of Jim, and thinking about your choices of education as a calling, and maybe how it all began when you first met Jim.
Oh gosh. Uh, I first met Jim by not meeting him, I suppose. I had never had a one-on-one encounter with him, but what I mean by meeting him without meeting him is that I heard about his classes, and the highlight of an otherwise tedious first semester freshman year involved hearing a couple friends of mine recount and recall the arguments that they considered while reading Aristotle's Ethics with Jim, and so I knew that for me that was it was just so exciting. So I just knew that first chance I had, I would have to sign up for one of his classes, and in fact I retook a class that I had already taken, um, so that I could revisit some of these works that with Jim, and so that's how it began.
Did you have a first impressions, Rob, memories of first impressions of Jim as a student?
Um, a commingling of excitement and trepidation, I think. And it wasn't Jim himself who scared me, but there's something when you're approaching, especially as a very young person, some of these ideas, then you get this idea of grandness or greatness that can be a little bit intimidating. I mean, when you think about virtue or happiness or justice or any of those things, I mean, the ideas themselves are so awful, meaning full of awe, that it can be a little intimidating, but nevertheless quite exciting.
Jim, thoughts or remembrances of Rob as a student before we move on to
Well,
topics?
I remember Rob very well, but I don't remember him, especially as a student in class. I do remember that he would like to continue discussing things after class, and he was one of the students who was most eager to do that sort of thing. And I remember that he suffered some misfortunes in college. He was injured playing soccer, and but he never lost his interest in learning, and he was one of the students who is memorable for being interested in what I had to teach.
Robert, you went on to study classics and become a classicist yourself, and now are part of the faculty at Hampden-Sydney. What was it like returning as now a colleague and peer of Jim's?
This sounds actually negative and a bit absurd, but there was nothing special per se about returning to Hampden-Sydney, because the places where I taught before, I taught at two large universities, a community college and a small liberal arts college. The job of teaching and the task at hand, that is, you have this you have this brain, this person in front of you. I really didn't treat that any differently at my alma mater than I did at another school. The second part of your question, what was it like coming back to work with Jim? That was just so wonderfully and repeatedly exciting, because again, we could talk about the ideas that we were teaching, but also how to get them across, how to shape the students' thinking. And sometimes it would be more practical nuts and bolts about, the Greek third declension, but sometimes it was a more general overview of what, for lack of a better phrase, I'll say the philosophy of education. So it was, it has been, it has made teaching here, although my teaching again is not, I don't think it's particularly distinct from the teaching that I was doing everywhere else, but the entirety of the teaching experience has become infinitely better for having Jim as a colleague.
Jim, is Rob the first former student who later became a colleague of yours?
He is the first former student who's become a colleague of mine as a teacher. Though there is another person here now at the college who was also my student in a Greek major, but he teaches economics. So he went to the other side in a sense,
Well, and I should add, Carlos, that and there's another who took Latin from Jim, and who now teaches and has been teaching biology here at the college. I don't think you'll mind my saying it's.
He's a very fine fellow, but he only had me for fourth semester Latin to finish his language requirement. So yeah, but I actually, as long as Rob has mentioned Professor Hartigan, who teaches biology, and he's a specialist in immunology. I've had a student who became the editor of the record, John Dudley, and another student, Paul Brammer, who worked for the fundraising department, which is now called the Office of Institutional Advancement. And I've had a couple others who worked at the college in one capacity or another. I had a student many years ago, one of my in my first few years here, Tom Robinson, who founded the Young Republicans on campus, and he became the director of publications for a year. He preceded Richard McClintock in that position, and there might have been a few others here and there. I've had some who worked in the library and other things.
Jim, I would imagine it's something very special to have a student come back and not just be a colleague, but be a colleague in classics.
It is, and I can tell you, having Rob in the department has made my last few years at the college really quite splendid. He is. I had a colleague when I first, not my first job, but my first job was at the graduate school, where they hired me for a couple of years because I was so young. They knew that I wouldn't be able. I looked like an adolescent. I wouldn't be able to find a job. And then I taught at Penn State, but I really wanted to be at a liberal arts college. And my first job was to be the colleague and to start a program in Western humanism at a different college from the one I went to, but where I had as a colleague one of my former professors, John Crossett, who was a wonderful colleague and really showed the possibility of academic collegiality, that one could continue to discuss important matters all the time. There was never much chit chat between us, but there was always we were arguing about this or that. And by argument, I want to say that I didn't say in a prior conversation where somebody confused argue with quarrel or fight. Argue comes from the Latin word arguo, which means to make coherent, to cohere, as distinct from discuss, which comes from discutio, which means to break apart. So I don't mind using the word argument, where we're really looking to form a coherent idea of something. I mean, discuss is like the Greek word analyze, which means to break into little parts and then try to put them back together in a form so that you can look at the whole and form a theory. But I've been able to argue with Rob many times, and I can tell you that he, far from being intimidated by me in argument, he is just the opposite. He wants to disagree with absolutely everything. And only occasionally, on a few days, when he's started over a little bit more, he realizes that maybe he went too far and being a little too obstreperous. But nothing could be better than to have an argument with a colleague who is challenging and doesn't freeze.
Note how I do myself in by objecting. Because if I, in fact, argue with everything and then I object that this is a hyperbolic statement, I'm arguing, he's making him right. So I should remain silent.
That would be unusual, yes.
If I can, maybe I'll ask the first question on the topic of the day, and I'll start by just getting your thoughts on the classical education. Both of you obviously personify that in your choice of profession. As education these days seems to be constantly discussed, debated, argued, sometimes put together, sometimes torn apart. And you reflect on the choice, Rob, I'll start with you, of choosing classics as your field of study in 2020. Love to get your thoughts on it, on the role of the classical education and of classics in today's educational environment.
Yes, well, so to study classics is in some way to study everything, because you're looking at the math, science, language, philosophy, literature. These all of these cultural aspects of the ancient world, the history. And so classics was appealing to me because of how wonderfully broad it is. But beyond that, I think the study of classics in particular does more to fulfill what might be the end goal that we always strive for, but happily never reach in education. So the etymologically, education would mean to lead out, and the suffix could mean either process or it could mean result. And if it means result, I think that's quite problematic. But if we see education as a process of leading out, of being led from a state of maybe ignorance and lack of awareness into a state of, I don't want to say enlightenment, but into a state of maybe greater awareness of the world around us. I think that this is a big part of education, and because of the wonderful, rich broadness of classics, it does it in a way that is, I think, for me, more it's fuller and more rich than the other fields of inquiry.
And maybe one follow-up question, as you hear people sometimes now sort of challenge the place of these authors and of this sort of body of work in current society, and with other voices needing to be included, what do you say to those people? How do you respond to the ones who doubt or question whether that legacy belongs today?
Well, I think it's unfortunately a this false dichotomy that's often behind a lot of the arguments. I mean, classics and is not mutually exclusive with other cultures, other thinkers, other writers, despite any differences in race, gender, ethnicity, anything like that. In fact, while misogyny was rampant in the ancient world, and there were certainly many forms of prejudice. I mean, the classical world is uh, likely more advanced socially than our society is today in respect to how we treat people with different skin color. I mean, it's that particular type of racism is there's really no evidence that that sort of behavior occurred. But I suppose I adhere to a view that is seen as utterly indefensible and somehow morally execrable. I've had people at other institutions tell me exactly that, and I really do believe in this idea of a human condition, and that all people at all times share an aspect of humanity that transcends culture and geography and race and ethnicity and sexual orientation. And so, as Longinus says on the Sublime, greatness speaks to all people at all times, I think this is why Toni Morrison once said in an interview that she doesn't want to be known as an African American writer; she wants to be known as an American writer. I mean, I think Ralph Ellison should be taught. Not because he's an African American writer, but because what he says is I think about the nature of alienation is will speak to all people at all times. That's not to say that critical race theory can't be applied to the invisible man. But yes, I really do think that that the works that we read in classics really do and can speak to all people at all times, and they transcend all of these particulars that in the end are less important. And I know it seems incendiary, but they're less important than the fundamental essential qualities of what it means to be human.
I think, Rob, that Toni Morrison would have answered the question better if she had said that she wanted to just be a writer, instead of an American writer. I was thinking that Susan Robbins, who taught rhetoric here for many years and just retired at the end of last year, published a novel, and I read the novel, and it was known as a Southern novel. But I told her one day right after I had finished the novel, that it could have taken place in Minneapolis, as far as I'm concerned, because it was more universal, and she was quite pleased by that. So I think Toni Morrison would have done better to say that she just wanted to be a writer, and her books would appeal to all people. I disagree with Rob on what he said about education, at least in part. I think he turned it into a kind of methodology of leading people out and not arriving any place. But I have a different sense of education. I think that we try to lead them to claims that are true, which means that they're universal, eternal, unchanging. And these are things like the meaning of happiness for human beings, or of justice, or of love, or many of the things that we teach. And I think those true statements, which are true for all people in all times, so long as human nature remains the same, were discovered by the ancients, not all of them, but the few great ones who've left their work as memorials to what human thought can achieve. And not only that, they spoke with a clarity that has become obscured over the centuries because of so much history and religions that substituted a belief for reason, and which confuse things a whole lot and makes it very difficult to break that wall of resistance to reflection. And when I was looking for a choice of life, I had a lot of pressure from my parents to become what would have been the sixth generation of physicians in my family. But I really wasn't interested. Once I had found Plato, which I did in high school. I took a philosophy course at my high school, and we read a number of dialogues. But once I discovered that, I think I abandoned the goal of dealing with ill bodies. I wanted to deal with the affliction of the soul, of ignorance and irrationality, and not the way a psychiatrist would, but which is my father was a psychiatrist and he dealt with mental illness, but the kind of mental debility which is a resistance to learning. And I wanted to cure the disease of ignorance as best I could, because I thought, what a cook does or what a chef does is he puts really good tasting things into the body, but what a teacher does is much more dangerous, because you can put errors into the souls of students, and you want to make sure that what they get, the food for thought, is nutritious and affirms goodness. So that's what I would say, and that's what I wanted to do, and I've tried hard to do that. It has meant having very few students, because the kinds of things that I teach aren't going to lead to high salaries. I have, which I didn't even intend to have here, but yesterday's Wall Street Journal was all about the future. Well, it was in large part about the future of education. And in all that talking about the future, there was only one young person who was 20 who spoke about the value of education, didn't rely on taking great courses on accounting or things like that, but learning how to live well. And there was one guy who completely contradicted himself. In the first sentence, he said we need to have smaller classes and more one-on-one instruction, but then later on he wanted almost everything to be over the internet, which is I guess there would be a kind of one-on-one if you only were with one person. But in any case, that's it. I think education has gone the wrong way. Most magazines and especially the Wall Street Journal publishes lists of schools by how much income you'll get in the first couple of years after you're graduated. I think that's the wrong approach. It's certainly not the classical approach to education.
Tim, I wanted to follow up on something you said, which was this idea of teaching people right and wrong. Doesn't that put a pretty high burden on the professor if you say that there's a ethical, moral component, perhaps the most important component of education is that person doing that has to be exceptional, no?
Well, it is hard, because you don't want to be like a preacher and just pour from the vase into the head of the student. The kind of teaching I try to do is Socratic teaching, dialectic, and there the dialectician or the teacher serves as a midwife to help the idea emerge from the student. And sometimes it's a really hard job, depending on how much they haven't thought, but they've just accepted things. But it just takes a few questions generally, at least to get them animated to defend as best they can. And then you have to, through a very slow and arduous process, show them that things which are self-contradictory can't be true. And some students react only with the terror that Rob said that he first encountered when he took a class. But but some, like Rob, are, while terrified, are still curious about it. And maybe you, Carlos, were just one such student too. So the success isn't the success of a successful politician, but it might be a deeper success that I've experienced. But yeah, it is risky. But I think I believe that ethics yields to rational arguments, and the big example is Aristotle.
I don't want anyone to get the wrong impression. Yes, that is Jim mentioned. There's no preaching, there's no proselytizing, there's nothing like that. I think that the best way that at least at present that I can describe Jim's teaching and the Socratic method is to draw an analogy to Robert Frost's definition of poetry. He says, poetry makes us remember what we forgot we knew. A conversation with Jim, side by side with a literary or philosophical or historical text makes you, I think it leads you to consider and to consider carefully an idea at hand. And it's this, the best classes end in this absolutely wonderful moment of realization of something that strikes you as true and that has always been true, and that you somehow knew but you weren't fully aware of. And so you leave class somehow being changed. I mean, it's extraordinary. And that's another reason classics was so attractive. And it wasn't just classics; it was the way Jim taught that was so extraordinary. So John Ciardi, the translator of Dante, gave an argument, I think, at Rutgers University once, and he said he was arguing for liberal arts, and he says, look, your life is a series of years and years, and break into months and months into weeks, weeks into days, days into hours. You got 24 hours, you're asleep 8 of them. So you're at 30 of your life, you're asleep. And then let's say if you've gone to school only to acquire certain skills for the sake of a job, well, your job's going to fill the other 8 hours of your life. Well, what are you going to do with the other 8 hours of your life? What exactly are you going to do? I mean, that's half of your waking life. And if what you're studying isn't somehow informing that, then you've really neglected most of your life. So classics, I think, is wonderfully practical. It does give you concrete skills, especially from studying the languages. But it also, more than anything else out there for me, informed how to live your life. So it filled in all 16 waking hours for me. And so when you wonder if you've been wronged by a friend, and then you go to class and you're reading De Amicitia with Jim, and you all of a sudden have insight on how you might better live your life. I mean, that's extraordinarily powerful. Or when you wonder if whether you're leading the right life, and you read Aristotle's Ethics with Jim, and you all of a sudden realize that you need to adjust your own decisions or behavior. I mean, that's extraordinarily powerful.
I would like to say something about your reference to Robert Frost, which I thought was really quite remarkable. Especially that it reminds you of things that you had forgotten. That's a very Platonic notion. That's the whole idea of the doctrine of what he says of recollection. but that things that you makes you remember things that you had forgotten, but you hadn't really forgotten them if you're remembering them. And that's the Greek word for truth. I think the etymology is just not known, and I don't know that anybody has observed it, but the word for truth is aletheia, and I think that comes from the verb lanthano, which means to elude or forget. And the river Lethe is the river of forgetfulness that you cross over when you are reincarnated into a new life, so you don't remember anything from the previous life. And the alpha in front of it, alethi, aletheia, means things that are not forgotten. And truth is never really forgotten. And that's why when you read a poem, you'll remember things that you have not really forgotten, because you can't remember something that is wholly forgotten. So I thought that's really a lovely remark, and it's certainly Platonic in spirit.
Rob, I was curious as whether you, in thinking yourself as not just say an intellectual guide, but almost an ethical or moral guide. And do you think that's something unique to classics? Is that something that belongs to all educators in one way or another?
Well, that's a really interesting question. My short answer is I don't know. It's because that's I've never thought about it. But let's see.
When you use words like right and wrong, right? These are very powerful words, and they bring a lot to the conversation. Same question, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I don't think it's unique to the classics. You can find good teachers in many fields. It's less likely that ethical questions will come up in a calculus class or in a physics class, but there are other. But philosophy is a very good subject, particularly ethics. A lot of philosophy is pretty much counting the angels on the head of a needle. I would say that that the best philosophers are those who and the most read are those who've dealt with ethics, and there are a number of good ones. Though I think the best ones are Aristotle. Is Aristotle on ethics. His book has never been surpassed. In fact, I don't think I brought it up before, but when Mark Nelson was teaching philosophy, he brought in a visitor that he had in college, a famous professor named Alistair McIntyre, and he had a telephonic lecture. This was in the 80s, and McIntyre had originally published a book in which he rejected Aristotle's ethics, but now he was publishing a recantation of that rejection. He rejected Aristotle because he, as he told us, that Aristotle says man is a political animal, and by political, Aristotle meant one who lives in the polis, but the city-state. But since now we lived in big countries, McIntyre said this is irrelevant, until he had this epiphany that Aristotle could have just meant that human beings are social animals, and we are. And then he liked Aristotle much better and published a recantation. And then I asked him whether there was any improvement in ethics since Aristotle, and he said, yes, in Christianity, the doctrine of humility. And then I said to him, but doesn't Aristotle say that that knowing yourself is knowing what you're capable of and where you fall short, and having an accurate sense of that. Whereas Christian humility, doesn't it mean that the God is responsible for all good and you don't deserve any of the credit? Isn't that? And if you're a Christian who expresses humility and you say you don't deserve any of the credit for something you've done, isn't that a kind of false humility? Because you're not taking credit, whereas you would take the blame for your actions. And he agreed that was in fact the case, and that Aristotle's definition of humility, which is understanding yourself truly, what you've done and what you deserve the credit for and what you don't, which is usually a bigger heap of things than those you do deserve credit for. He said then no, that he agreed that there was nothing new, no improvements in ethics after Aristotle.
Jim, is there a paradox though in works like Aristotle's Ethics, which is that they're complicated. It's just to study them requires a lot of time and effort, and so they're not the most accessible things to acquire and to teach, and yet at the same time, so they're reserved for people who you have to be sort of smart enough and dedicated enough and willing to put in the time to get to these kinds of works, and yet at the same time they're the most universal. So it is at once a very elite thing and yet the most general thing of all. How do you resolve that?
I would answer it in a way that I think you will immediately agree. We all know what triangles are, and you don't have to be very educated to know what a triangle is, a plain closed figure with 3 lines, consisting of 3 lines. But a geometrician knows it much better. But it doesn't, you don't have to, in order to live your life, you don't have to know a triangle and know about the angles and bisecting the angles and how, if you do 3 bisections of the angles and draw the altitudes, etc., that all those points of intersection will be on the arc of a circle. You don't need to know what's called the 9-point circle in order to be able to live your life. And the same with Aristotle, and the same with the Greek tragedies. You don't have to read Aristotle to have a kind of intuitive sense that being honest or being a just person and practicing self-control is a good thing. You can know it intuitively and by having good examples. You don't have to study it the way an ethicist, a philosopher would study it. But there is a class of people who says, why should I be a just person just because you tell me to be just? And for that person, the arguments of Aristotle are useful because he'll tell you how it actually conduces to happiness. But it's not necessary to have read Aristotle or to have studied Aristotle at all. If you have good examples, and even those examples don't have to have studied Aristotle. Aristotle is giving the arguments for things that we should know.
Rob, your thoughts on the view sometimes that the classics and some of these things are quote unquote elite or elitist?
Yeah, there's absolutely nothing more reprehensible, I think, in academia than any sort of elitism. I think some of the understandable backlash in the country against professors is that, it's hard not to think very often that who else in the world besides professors, maybe politicians, they wake up, they look in the mirror and they say, if only the world thought exactly as I do, and that's really, really horrible. So just to go back to your previous question about right and wrong, I don't, I don't, and I think Jim and I might differ here a little bit. I don't, what I mean by right and wrong is that if Aristotle says that every action is thought to aim at some good, I mean, is that statement right or wrong? Or is it maybe we can't decide? But we can think long and hard about whether or not that statement stands up, is reasonable, is logical, is rational, and then we can move to the second sentence. And if we continue to do this, and we conclude that happiness is a complete life of virtuous action in accordance with reason, then it's right, not because I say so, not because of any sort of tendentious designs that I have for the students, but it's right because it stands up to reason and to logic and to rationality. So, and for that reason, because things seem to be to varying degrees knowable. It's based on reason. It's anti-elitist. Anybody exercising his or her capacity to reason can access these texts. I mean, I really can't imagine anything less elitist. Yes, the languages are very, very hard, and it requires an awful lot of dedication. And yes, I think that there's probably a larger cultural and historical sort of elitist stance, maybe that classicists have taken, but there's nothing about the study of these works at all that's in the least bit elitist. They should be, I think, and are for everyone.
Rob, let me talk a little bit about liberal arts, right? A topic that came up a little bit earlier. And what does that concept mean to you? One of the debates I've been involved with someone in the past has been, it is studying, for example, if you're an English major and you spend most of your time in college reading English literature, is that a liberal arts education in the sense that it's liberal arts? My sense is the things you need to be a good citizen, right? To be a good member of, a productive member of society. And so as you define liberal arts and the liberal arts education, do you see it as what most people would think of it as one of those subjects, or do you find it in a different way, given society today?
I think somebody at a university who's majoring in English is not necessarily getting a liberal arts education by any means. If most or all of what you're doing is English, then maybe you're wading knee deep into the pool of liberal arts, but there's something quite lacking. If you're majoring in English here, then you're also, of course, just like any other student, you're required to do approximately 60 hours of other core requirements, and you are getting, maybe you're getting, waist deep into the pool of liberal arts there. So you're going a little more deeply into it. But I don't think that any given department here at Hampden-Sydney can claim that it alone is the key to liberal arts. And even though I mentioned at the beginning of this conversation how broad and inclusive classics is, I mean, it's unlikely if you major in classics, you're going to take a classical mathematics course, for example, and you might not, unfortunately, they're not specific classes in ancient science, although all of those things could be taught. But yeah, I don't think that English, you're not. English alone is.
You accept that part of a liberal arts education today would be something like biology or genetics, right? These other subjects that are really important to know. Jim, go ahead.
I think that to study, to have the education befitting a free person, which is what liberal arts were for, it doesn't require studying ancient mathematics, but it does involve studying one of the discoveries of ancient mathematics, and that is still in use today, and that is the concept of the proof. And apparently the first proof is credited to Thales, who is also the father of philosophy. And when one does a proof and goes through from definitions, from axioms, and then definitions to theorems, which is still is the method of mathematics, one comes to a conclusion which is so very persuasive. When you go through a geometric proof or a proof in any mathematics, and you take those courses that require proofs instead of just learning how to do figuring, you are learning what it is to know and you have a standard of knowledge. When you've been through a proof, you really feel in a way that you know something, whereas you don't feel when you read an interpretation of Shakespeare or a movie review. You are fully persuaded that you know, and having a standard of knowledge is part of what it means to be a free people. So you'll know what you do know, and more importantly, you'll know what you don't know, and you won't get those two things confused. And you don't have to take an ancient science course or mathematics course to do that. The problem with English, I think, is that they stopped reading literature, and now they're reading exotic theories, which are highly politicized. And that's the English courses that I took when I was in college. We just read the principal authors, and the great authors who, as Rob mentioned, stood the test of time, passed the test of time, and were great authors. But a number of other liberal arts courses are important, but it's not necessary to do them in antiquity, though you could. For instance, in art or theater, you see different versions of the same kind of scene. You see, you might read you might see even different versions of the same play. You see Hamlet, and you see 5 or 6 different actors who are interpreting the scene or Hamlet's speech in different ways. And each time you look at one, you think it can't be any better than that. But you discover that all these interpretations lend some addition to the text, and that teaches you that really the diversity of opinions is helpful on those subjects which are not mathematical. You don't want a diversity of opinions on how much 2 and 2 are, or how many angles there are, or about the angles of a triangle. But when it comes to art, you want that, and that's part of what a liberal education gives you. So this range of subjects has different effects on the psyche, and the cumulative effect of taking a bunch of different courses, each of which is contributing a different subject, a different value, a different moral value, are useful to have in a liberal education. You become a freer person.
And I'd like to add to that, if I could, that I think that some people would readily object to some of what's been said by saying, well, you're closing yourself off to way too much of the rest of the world. But the more you delve into classics, the more the world, I think, actually opens up. And so, when you look at the Middle Eastern influences on Greek religion, on music, on perhaps poetic meter, the world starts opening up more and more, because cultures are not cultures are constantly in flux and exchanging ideas and thoughts with each other. And so I think you really start seeing a very broad continuum. I think that what led Ezra Pound, who, yes, had fascist views, what led him, I think, to the study of Chinese was his start in classics, and the philosophical and literary and aesthetic connections he then found in Chinese culture and in Chinese thought.
You bring up other cultures. Should classics include classical Chinese philosophy, classical Japanese literature, classical Indian history? Or does it need to be relabeled Western classics, or should it?
You're equivocating, Carlos, on the word classic. I suppose it should include also classic Coca-Cola.
Well, I'm posing the question of it's called classics, but it's actually just one part of the classical heritage, right? Should it, on a serious note, should it include other classical, literary, philosophical?
Well, it's a different subject. classics, as we've been using it, refers to the heritage from Greece and Rome, but certainly other cultures have great works, and that would be in a world literature course, and they're classics by extension.
But isn't there something extra you give a work by putting the label classics on it and not just a classic?
Well, no more so, Carlos, who you're doing more than lightly moderating.
I'm
But
trying to understand.
but I think that's just fine. But you are also giving status to a book that you call a great book just by using the word great, and classical in the sense that you're using it just means great.
Well, I would imagine you do think there is something, and I won't use the word better, but different about your world, right? About the
Well,
Western
it has the
classical.
advantage of not of being dead and gone. All the people who lived in the classical period are dead, and so when, for example, we look at the Trojan War or the Peloponnesian War, we don't have to root for the Trojans or for the Greeks. We see the follies of all and the stupidities of all of them. And that's true in Thucydides. When we read the Peloponnesian Wars, you'd be hard pressed to root for the Athenians or for the Spartans. Your heart breaks for all of them because they all are committing suicide at the same time. And that's the virtue of the classics. It's in American history, especially in Virginia, the Civil War was certainly still being fought when I came here, and but so teaching the Civil War presented problems to those people who did it, but teaching the Peloponnesian War gives us objectivity. That's one of the virtues of the classics. We don't have a stake in it. We can be more philosophical. We can look at it the way the gods look down at humanity.
Rob, let me ask you the question about the other traditions and how you see them. Do they belong in the classics curriculum?
How do I see the other traditions?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry, I just didn't hear. So the other, I mean, given enough time and resources, yeah, I would like to study all of these things. I don't think that studying classes excludes, it doesn't mean the Mahabharata is now irrelevant. It doesn't mean that the tale of Genji shouldn't be read. It doesn't mean any of those things. It's simply it's starting with what's familiar and moving to what's ostensibly and initially less familiar, but the great pleasure I've had in reading non-Western works, and maybe I just don't understand them well enough, is seeing seeing connections with some Western works that that show that people are people and have been, from time immemorial. That there's something lasting and important about human beings and what we experience, and I think looking at non-Western literature in particular demonstrates this beautifully.
I couldn't agree more with what you've said. I read when you read. I had to read The Tale of Genji because I had a friend who fell in love with all things Japanese and coerced me into reading The Tale of Genji, and the people there were just the same as people everywhere. That I've read some African novels and plays, and the people are just the same. Human nature doesn't change. I mean, children cry the same in Tanzania as they do here. People are rebellious, envious. They fall in love. They're just the same. There's a constancy to human nature. The canons of non-Western art are somewhat different and they're unfamiliar, but they're interesting, and they combine fantasy with reality in some South American novels, which I've read. And although they don't follow the canons of Western art, they're wonderful books. But a classicist can't actually, even though Rob said that we cover everything, we can't teach physics, and we can't teach calculus and linear algebra and so on. It would be a false condemnation of our field, because we don't really cover everything completely. We concentrate on Greek and Roman heritage.
Oh, one more. Oh, go ahead, Rob.
Well, I'm saying, so I agree, and I just want to add that I mean, it seems to be that the big question is, to what degree is culture determinative of thought? And I think that we have many colleagues who would say that it's almost entirely determinative of what people think and how they think. And I just disagree. I think it's influential, but I don't assign it as absolutely undeniably essential as I think other people do. I think that there's something basically human that is going to come through in spite of any cultural influences, linguistic influences, etc.
But it's no more true than in mathematics and in science. People in Japan and China and other places, once they learn the principles of Western science and chemistry and mathematics, adopt them and achieve great success. Nobody is better than the Indian mathematics, even if, the mathematics speaks to all mathematicians.
And I'm sorry, I'll be back in 10 seconds. I just realized my battery's low. I'm sorry.
Better his battery than his internal battery.
That seems fine.
Yeah, but he'll be back. Yeah, he these electronic equipment made us all dependent on batteries. But I predict that by the time Dino and Enzo, Carlos, your sons are our age, batteries won't be a problem anymore. They'll have something that lasts forever. The old view of nuclear power, where you didn't have to have a meter of electricity in your house, will be achieved by the time your sons are our age.
Well, we're almost out of time for our conversation, so I wanted to pose at least one last question, and that is, this has been a remarkable year for education. So many different things that have had to be adopted, right, in higher ed. Maybe looking past COVID and thinking about the role of educators, especially in a small liberal arts college like Hampden-Sydney, which is home to both of you. What do you see when you look into the future of a college like Hampden-Sydney and of liberal arts education?
Well, I think that the pandemics will probably occur more often, and there'll be desire to have education which is safe. And I predict that we'll see it next semester when the vaccine isn't yet available and the disease spreads, that there'll be more online instruction. I have been teaching online off and on. I've taught in person this semester, except when my students were quarantined, and then we had the instruction over Zoom. But my classes have been small, and the Zoom has worked just as well. I'm so close to my students who appear on the screen that I can practically smell their aftershave lotion. I think that the Zoom is a fine substitute for in person, and it obviates the need for buildings, and there'll be much more of that. But I think even if it's over Zoom, it should be the best education will be with small numbers, and it'll be give and take, and it'll be argument in the Socratic method.
Rob, your thoughts?
Yeah, so one of the differences between me and Jim is that no matter how horrific something may seem, no matter how terrible a person's actions may be, Jim strives without fail to find the most charitable explanation. And Carlos, you know this. I mean, I want to stress, I mean, true sort of charity to explain a terrible situation or someone's actions that have been, you know, that they're questionable. One of my innumerable faults is that I'm the opposite. The only thing precocious about me is that I became a curmudgeon when I was probably 26. I mean, it's just, I'm not proud of this, but I take a much more bleak view of education. I think it's just not getting any better. I think that I have at least co-taught part of one class on Zoom. It worked well enough because it was a discussion-based class. I think that it has many other limitations, but Jim's book on Plato, there's a brief discussion about Jim cites a passage, a very important passage in Plato's 7th letter, in which Plato says something like, you know, my real philosophy has never been put in writing, nor can it be. And he says that real learning comes from much living together and much speaking together. And when that happens, there's a, Jim can correct me, I might be getting particulars wrong, but there's some sort of spark that then that occurs. And so I think that it needs to be, yes, Socratic, small, but in person. I don't know that that Zoom is a particularly good equivalent, and I don't know that, and I fear that education in general will be more and more skills based. It's you know, for some time we're required to put on our syllabi, it says student learning outcomes. Now this is seemingly, how could anyone object to this? You know, so it's like going to a restaurant and the deal is you give me $8.12, I give you a hamburger. You know, it's this transactional sort of thing. And the same thing, you take this class and you're going to get this, this, and this. These are the outcomes of student learning. But I think that there's, and I put these on my syllabi, but I think there's something quite problematic about the transactional nature now of education. And I when I was in graduate school, I was teaching a Greek class, and I was, you know, required to put the student learning outcomes. I had one only, and it was, I wrote aphoretic ecstasy. And then I was called in, and the supervising professor said, yeah, I would like to take a class, but like that, but where the accrediting body is going to have problems with this. You have to have actual skills coming out of this that you can point to. You can't just say that you're going to that you're going to revel in philosophical uncertainty. That's wrong. No. So I'm very I'm cynical.
Well, on an uncynical note, as you know, the goal of these lectures, or these dialogues, sorry, better put, has been to commemorate, you know, Jim's final year as an educator at Hampden-Sydney. Any thoughts before we sign off, Rob, on that accomplishment?
My first teaching job was at an all-male boarding school, and after my first year, a former teacher said, how'd it go? And I told him how just very, very well it seemed to have gone. And he said, yeah, The trick isn't doing it for a couple years. The trick is for doing it for 30. And here Jim has done it for 42, and that's just at Hampden-Sydney. So I think, I think, um, I think if there's anyone who was ever born to teach, it was Jim. So something that people might not know is that I think even as early as ninth grade, Jim was waking up in New York City and getting on the subway and going into Harlem to tutor students there. And he in graduate school he began immediately to teach really when no one else was quite interested in doing that. I mean, generally graduate school is more research based, and he just taught with extraordinary success from the very start. He also, when he came in 1978, I mean, this job is pretty hard, and you don't have an abundance of free time, but Jim realized that Prince Edward County there's no way to take Latin. No way. So what does he do? I would have said that's too bad. It's too bad. But he took it upon himself to go and to.
That's not quite accurate. In my third year, the school wanted to encourage integration. And they thought that by offering Latin at the public school, it would encourage integration. And they asked virtually everybody they had heard of, and the last one was me. And I said, yeah, I would be happy to do it. And I did it, but it wasn't on my own. I thought it was a good cause to foster integration of the public school, which was at that time almost exclusively African American, because there was a white flight school. And so I did it for that reason. I did it.
Okay.
I taught Latin there for 6 years, first and second year Latin.
Okay, so I've admittedly gotten the particulars wrong, and I think it's even more compelling that it was to learn Latin, but it was also to assist in the all-important job of integrating the schools. But and Carlos, certainly and I think anybody who's taken one of Jim's classes knows immediately what an absolutely extraordinary teacher he is. And this is in addition to doing R1 level research and doing just countless things for the college, including really revitalizing the entire Western culture program. And so it's just I would need 100 more tongues and 100 more minutes to really express even imperfectly how absolutely extraordinary his accomplishments have been.
Thank you, Rob. Jim, final question to you. It's a great accomplishment to teach students and hopefully to make them better people. It's even greater accomplishment, I would imagine, to have one of them following your footsteps and to become a classicist himself. Any final thoughts on that?
I can only speak to the latter part. It's a great pleasure to see Rob. I feel actually some level of comfort knowing that he'll be here and that he'll be teaching students, and I have no doubt but that he'll do a much better job than I have done, because it's a poor student who doesn't surpass his master. And I think he has already shown how devoted and how excellent a teacher he is. He's already won the Good Teaching Award at Hampden-Sydney. And it doesn't always go to the person that everybody thinks is a good teacher. But in his case, I don't know of anybody who didn't think that he really deserved it. You know?
Well, Jim, thank you. Rob, thank you. Thanks for your time, both of you.
Well, thank you, Carlos, for doing these, and I hope you'll let Rob and me talk for a few minutes before you turn us off, because okay.
As usual, we'll do so. Let me pause the recording.